economic environment could have on growth in developing countries. We'll hear from World Bank chief economist Joseph Stiglitz and the author of the report, Milan Brombaut. The briefing lasts about an hour.
Thank you. Mr. Stiglitz has noted the overall functions of the Global Prospects Report. A recurring theme in this year's report is that the growing integration of developing countries in the world economy implies change and adaptation on a large scale, change in both developing and developed countries, and in the nature and intensity of the relationships between them. The report develops four main messages. First of all, developing country growth has already picked up in the 1990s, and given continuation of reforms and a broadly favorable external environment, it is likely to accelerate further in the coming decade. It's also likely that a wider range of countries will share in this faster growth. Second, given more rapid growth and integration, the next 25 years could witness an unprecedented increase in the weight of developing countries in the world economy, in particular of the big five developing countries, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, and Russia. This change will generate important benefits for the world, but will also require significant adjustments in many countries. Third, the expansion of global production networks by multinational enterprises and their partners is providing an increasingly important channel for developing countries to access global know-how and to establish themselves in world markets. Finally, the ability of countries to adapt to change is becoming ever more critical, and this requires that governments evaluate the costs of adjusting to global integration realistically and undertake the policies needed to minimize such costs. Obviously, my purpose here is to encourage you to read the report and not to replicate it. So in what follows, I'm just going to touch on some of the highlights organized around these four propositions. Starting with the prospects for developing countries, we note that growth in these developing countries, excluding the transition economies, has averaged around 5% in the 1990s so far, up from only about 3% or so in the 1980s. Indeed, last year, growth touched over 5.5%, which was the strongest in 20 years. In the last 2 to 3 years, growth has also been stronger in many low-income countries containing a high proportion of the world's poor. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa and in India. Last year, only about 1/5 of developing countries experienced declining per capita incomes. This was down from an average of about half of all developing countries in the 1980s. The broadly favorable international environment that has contributed to this revival in growth is likely, we think, also to be sustained. Consensus views suggest that industrial countries, which take around 60% of developing country exports, should continue moderate but relatively stable growth, with inflation staying at low levels. Restrained inflation, in turn, will be important in maintaining moderate interest rate levels, as indeed will the trend towards fiscal consolidation in most industrial countries. With this backdrop, the longer-run prospect for private capital flows to developing countries should remain sound. These flows have soared from around 1% of developing country GDP in 1990 to around 4.5% or $250 billion in 1996. While the pace of increase may slow from the kind of scorching 30% pace seen last year, factors supporting long-run growth include continued policy reform and liberalization in developing countries, the growing interest in portfolio diversification amongst investors in the rich countries, and also the expansion of global production networks by multinationals. The last decade has also seen an acceleration in world trade growth to around 6% a year in volume terms, which has been around 3 to 4 percentage points more than world output growth. Again, implementation of multilateral trade liberalization under the Uruguay round, other trade liberalization initiatives, and continued improvements in transport and communication technology should support robust continued growth in world trade of around 6% or so. Given this kind of favorable context, we are expecting developing country growth to strengthen further to about 5.5% over the coming decade. Compared to the last decade, growth is expected to rise in every region except East Asia, where it is expected to remain strong. Compared to last year's report, we have upgraded projections for several regions, including the Middle East and North Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, on the basis of gathering evidence that economic reforms are taking root and are becoming more consolidated in many countries. The report does underline, though, that although the outlook for the world economy remains favorable, the risks at the level of individual countries can be considerable. Greater competitive pressures and problems of economic management posed by increased trade and capital market integration can reduce the margin for policy errors, as illustrated by the currency crises in East Asia. If growth in the industrial countries is more cyclical, or if inflation revives more strongly, interest rates could snap back much more sharply than we currently expect. Countries which are relying heavily on short-term capital inflows to finance large external deficits and which have significant banking sector problems might be especially vulnerable in this context. All in all, though, the generally positive outlook that I have outlined suggests that the next 25 years are likely to see the emergence of developing countries as major players in the world economy. The big five developing countries that I've referred to contain around 1/2 of the world's labor force, but today they comprise only about 8 to 10% of world output and trade. On fairly conservative assumptions about growth, these proportions could double by the year 2020. The share of all developing countries in world output would increase from around 1/6 in the early 1990s to approaching 1/3 by 2020. Compared to long-run historical trends in the world economy over, say, the last 200 years, this change would be unprecedented in both its size and its speed. One implication of this scenario is that faster-growing developing countries will also become much more important in world trade. Developing countries are likely, under this scenario, to become major export markets for the industrial countries, increasing their share of developed countries' exports from around 1/4 to around 40%. About 50 cents in every dollar's worth of OECD export growth in the period to 2020 would be going to developing countries. And in our scenario, developing countries are also the fastest growing markets for all major industrial sectors, ranging from primary agriculture through various kinds of manufacturers to services. More opening up and faster growth in these big five developing countries will have significant economic benefits for the industrial countries and also for most developing countries and regions. These gains arise partly because countries have more opportunities to specialize in the things that they're good at. For example, the industrial countries would have much more opportunities to specialize on exports of services and such or financial services. Countries will also gain from lower prices for the things that they import from these big five countries and for higher prices for the things that they export. So we find, for example, that developing country regions that benefit the most under this scenario, areas like the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the rest of Latin America, in part do so because of strengthening demand in the big five countries for primary commodities. At the same time, one has to note that faster opening up and growth amongst labor-abundant giants like China and India may also increase competitive pressures on countries with a similar structure of resources, chiefly in the rest of Asia, increasing the incentives on these countries to speed up their own kind of reforms in order to foster quick adjustment to increasingly competitive conditions. I'm going to sort of fairly briefly touch on the last couple of themes that are developed in the report. One of them is that the expansion of global production by multinational enterprises is becoming one of the key channels through which developing countries are becoming more integrated in the world economy. There are several indexes of how production by multinationals is expanding. One of these is here that in the manufacturing sector, The foreign affiliates of multinationals alone account for 1/5 of world manufacturing output at present, and this has increased fairly sharply over the last 20 years or so. If we take both the parent companies and foreign affiliates of multinationals, something like 1/5 of world GDP is produced by multinationals at present. Especially significant is the fact that the fastest increase in this kind of production by multinationals in the 1990s is occurring in the developing countries. This factor is also having a big impact on the nature of world trade. Something like 1/3 of world trade these days occurs within different units of the same multinational. It's also reflected foreign production by multinationals is also becoming much more oriented towards world export markets rather than exploiting the domestic market of the country where the investment takes place. This last feature actually points to one of the important benefits for developing countries from this kind of production, which is that they have a much wider set of opportunities to participate in world trade now. For example, you don't have to become an expert in producing an entire automobile in order to participate in the world auto market now. If you can master, say, production of radiator caps for General Motors' global production network, then this is a much easier and ready way in which to enter world markets. Approaching 1/3 of China's exports today are by companies that have some degree of foreign investment in them, which I think is a fairly staggering kind of figure. Another important benefit from multinationals, of course, is that these companies are characterized by ownership of know-how and various kinds of intangible or specialized assets. Something like 60% of all research and development in the United States takes place by U.S. multinationals, which is also quite a striking figure. And this know-how and these assets create the basis for a variety of benefits in developing countries, including diffusion of new management and work practices, introduction of new ideas or information about world markets, in general, opportunities to catch up with the best practices in the world economy. A final theme that the report notes is that global integration entails adjustment costs. Liberalization of trade, for example, requires resources to be shifted between sectors, and workers in certain sectors may become unemployed for a time before they find work in expanding sectors of the economy. And the output losses that result from this, which are labeled the social cost of adjustment, in practice, the evidence suggests that these losses tend to be temporary and they tend to be fairly small, especially relative to benefits. To take one fairly kind of rough and ready measure, trade liberalization has not interrupted continued increases in employment in most cases that have been studied. However, it is true that the size of these adjustment costs will depend on the kind of policies that governments follow. They will certainly be larger if things like macroeconomic instability reduces the credibility of trade reforms and prevents a quick pickup in private investment. Adjustment will also be delayed and its costs will tend to be larger if labor markets and other factor markets lack flexibility. Sort of very extensive regulation of formal labor markets can be one source of such inflexibilities, as sometimes can be the employment practices of state-owned enterprises. We'd end by noting that even though the overall social costs of liberalization, as far as the evidence suggests, are quite small, the private costs for particular groups of businessmen or workers can often be quite high. And these groups will often be very strongly motivated to oppose liberalization, whereas the benefits tend to be very widespread, and therefore the kind of support for liberalization may tend to be more muted, even though it's larger. And understanding these kind of political economy issues is going to be an important issue for governments that are undertaking reforms. And we can also say that it may also be desirable for reasons of social equity for governments to implement carefully designed social safety net measures to assist the most vulnerable groups in society who may be adversely affected by reforms. Mr. Stiglitz is now going to provide a few comments on the theme of the report.
Thank you. The developments and trends described in this report raise a few issues on which I would like to comment. Globalization and technological progress are opening up unprecedented opportunities for poor countries to accelerate their development. But these changes are also posing a broad new agenda of more complex and challenging policy reforms that will need to be tackled if these opportunities are to be fully realized. Many of these issues center on creating the institutional infrastructure needed to make markets work more effectively. First, I would like to discuss some of the lessons of the recent currency turmoil in Southeast Asia. Most observers have emphasized the external aspects of the crisis and the role of problematic macroeconomic fundamentals in the speculative attack on the currencies. This is important. It underlines the risks of crisis for developing countries in a world of mobile capital, even for countries with a record of strong economic performance. I would like to emphasize another lesson from the crises, one that often gets less attention. The importance of strengthening domestic financial sector supervision and institutions in countries undergoing financial integration. Structural problems in the banking sector, including excess real estate investment and over-reliance on short-term borrowing and foreign currency, combined with long-term assets denominated in local currency, played a crucial role in at least one country, Thailand. These happened in part because of weaknesses in credit appraisal capabilities, inadequate prudential safeguards and supervisory capability, and lack of transparency about the health of the financial system. Eroding investor confidence was reflected in the large increase in short-term external liabilities in the build-up of the crisis, while delay in the adoption of strong adjustment measures contributed to the vehemence of the crisis when it finally broke. Financial integration has thus clearly increased the urgency and importance of domestic financial sector reforms. These include enhanced prudential supervision and regulation and the establishment of proper incentive structures and legal and accounting frameworks. They include strengthening of bank capital adequacy and loan loss reserves. In some instances, development of policy instruments to give greater control over surges of short-term capital inflows and domestic credit booms may be useful. But financial integration is not the only facet of globalization that is bringing new reform and institutional challenges to the forefront. This year's Global Prospects report highlights the expansion of global production activities by multinational enterprises. In the past, economists emphasized the importance of foreign direct investment as a source of capital and jobs for developing countries. We now realize that the more important role played by multinational enterprises is helping developing countries improve their access to world-class skills in global markets. This new emphasis on knowledge shifts the focus from the quantity of foreign direct investment to its quality. This in turn depends on the policies adopted by host countries. The Global Prospects report documents the growing evidence that knowledge spillovers and other benefits for multinational enterprises are increased by pro-competitive policies adopted by host countries. Policies that enhance competition through open foreign trade and investment regimes, and by reducing domestic barriers to entry, will be of growing importance. This is particularly clear in the service sector, which contain infrastructure industries such as telecommunications, which are a key to the economy as a whole. Some of these sectors have traditionally been considered natural monopolies and have been either operated or heavily regulated by the state. Now, we know that private provision and introduction of new technology by foreign firms can be a very effective way of improving performance in these sectors if a proper regulatory structure can be set up to ensure competition or prevent abuse of monopoly power. This combination of openness to foreign investment and improved domestic regulation was manifest in the recent landmark WTO agreement to liberalize international trade in basic telecommunication services. In addition to market opening, many countries also announced a commitment to a set of principles governing domestic regulation policies. This highlights the growing overlap between globalization issues on the one hand and domestic policy issues on the other. This year's report notes the need for careful analysis of the cost of adjustment associated with globalization, as well as of longer-term implications for social policy and for the environment. It is worth noting that the analysis of the emergence of the Big Five developing countries does not support the concern sometimes expressed that trade with developing countries is the main factor behind deterioration in the conditions of employment of unskilled workers in some industrial countries over the past 10 to 20 years. The bulk of academic research on this question also finds trade with poor countries to have at most contributed slightly to wage stagnation or higher unemployment for unskilled workers. There is also little evidence of trade liberalization having contributed to poverty in developing countries, as is sometimes asserted. On the contrary, there is growing evidence that openness to the outside world is positively associated with growth in the long run, and rapid growth is the single most important influence in achieving sustainable reductions in poverty. The final issue I would like to discuss is the worry about the world's diminishing natural resources. Since the Club of Rome in the early 1970s, alarmists have predicted increasing scarcities and sharply rising prices for agricultural and mineral products. These predictions have proven totally unfounded, as relative prices of these commodities has actually fallen in the last 2 decades. To give just one example, agricultural productivity has improved to the point that India is now a net exporter of food. The analysis in this respect suggests that faster growth in developing countries is unlikely to result in sharp price increases for food or energy, the 2 sectors studied in the report, at least in the near future. The reasons are that we will continue to see productivity improvements that allow the increased production of food and energy combined with greater energy efficiency that will restrain demand. A somewhat different concern is the potential impact of fast growth in developing countries on the environment. The threatened effect of fossil fuel burning on the greenhouse gas effect and climate change has drawn particular attention this year. Consensus views expect most future increases in greenhouse gases to come from developing countries. Win-win policies that reduce greenhouse gases by eliminating economic distortions that are harmful in their own right can make some contribution. New institutional devices to reduce emissions in the most efficient way, such as new markets to trade emission credits or permits, can also be useful. In the long run, the scientific consensus suggests that development and transfer of new energy technologies will be a decisive factor in mitigating climate change. Global Economic Prospects is part of an ongoing program to understand the dynamics of globalization, including its promises and pitfalls. The questions raised by the report are vital ones, and we intend to come back to them as more evidence and research accumulate.
Okay, Joe, thanks. Let's take some questions. We've got mobile mics in the aisleway. If you can wait for the mic, let us know who you are and who you represent. We'll get on fine and dandy. So, first question there in the middle.
Mr. Stiglitz, about what you said about developing in this, especially in these big 5 countries, will not increase food and fuel prices. That doesn't seem quite right, because in these 5 countries, they represent about more than half the world's population, and if they develop at this rate, consumption of food and fuel will increase sharply. And there are other organizations like CGIAR and World Watch which keep telling us that these are very finite resources, and there will be shortages of food and fuel and all that. And now if the consumption goes up to that extent, won't prices automatically increase, bringing inflation and other things?
World prices for food and energy and other resources represent a balance of demand and supply. What the experience has been over the past several decades is that technological change can lead to an enormous increase in supply. The example that I referred to in my remarks was India, which has become a net exporter of food, even though it's been growing. Its economy has been growing at a very rapid rate over the last several years. In the case of energy, there's an additional factor, which is that we are becoming more efficient in the utilization of energy. We're developing new technologies for conservation, and I think more of our energy should be devoted to developing these more conservation-minded technologies. Now, as I did remark, that in the long run, there is concern about not so much about the price of energy, but about the greenhouse gas effects from carbon emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. The focus of concern has to be both on making sure that there is a transfer of these new technologies and the development of new technologies to all the countries of the world.
We've got a question here, just in the middle.
Well, I was just going to add one piece on that. The report actually does take up the debate that has gone on, in particular with respect to food production. So it explicitly considers the analysis put forward by the World Watch Institute about sharp possible increases in food prices. And there has been quite a bit of debate about that study, and the bulk of the work that has come in from organizations like the FAO, International Food Policy Research Institute, and also from the World Bank, looking at the kind of productivity trends and yield trends and the technological possibilities. The consensus still seems to be that there is quite a bit of room for further productivity growth to offset the kinds of demand increases. So many of these studies actually still project declining prices out to 2015 or 2020. And what our study kind of suggests is that faster growth in these big developing countries, what it does do is it prevents prices from falling faster than they would otherwise. Those are the kind of results that we've arrived at.
In the middle here. Yeah. Here's the microphone.
Eb Bauman, El Universal of Venezuela. You mentioned the need for further institutional reform, the second generation of reform, things like judicial reform and investment guarantees and so forth. That doesn't seem to be proceeding. It's not a matter of just statistical growth. It's a matter of human resources and political will. And the studies that were released just last week on the Andean Pact over at the Brookings Institute, Sebastian Edwards, the former chief economist of the World Bank, said that there's grave danger now of these countries going backwards. In fact, he cited statistics that indicated they were. But this initial growth through macroeconomic reform is not holding up without these second-generation reforms.
Well, I think you're right to emphasize that what these are called these second-generation reforms, reforms not only in judicial systems, but reforms in regulatory policies, trade liberalization, and so forth. In various parts of the world, I think there are different experiences, and each of you probably know the experiences of the countries that you deal with most intimately, probably well, and know the problems. But one also has to keep a certain distance. In some areas, I think the reforms there has not been, the reforms are likely to be permanent and there won't be backsliding. An example of that is very few countries have reversed the policies of trade liberalization. I think one has to keep on guard against the development of non-tariff barriers to substitute for tariff barriers. So there's a real message that one can slip backwards and one can find alternative ways of creating protection. But that's one area which so far I think has remained fairly firm. There's been progress in many countries in the world in telecommunications policy, which is very important in allowing for the private sector to come in and develop this very important part of the infrastructure that interacts so much with the private sector. A number of countries have had judicial reforms and are moving in that direction. It's an extremely difficult area. But it's an area in which the bank has increasingly become involved in. One of the messages that we emphasize in the World Development Report this year, and that the bank as a whole is emphasizing, is that one has to keep on. It's one of the, having done the first round, it's the second round that is increasingly important, putting in place competition policy as another example of a second round issue that some countries have found that they privatized but hadn't put in place competition policies, and they wound up transferring a government monopoly to a private monopoly. Now they realize that if you're going to have markets require not only private ownership, but they also require, if they're going to work, require competition. these messages, I think, are getting across, and you know, some countries will make faster advances on one aspect and other countries on another. But I think part of our job is to continually to focus on these second round issues, as you call them.
Up the back there.
Hi, Flávia Séculos from Jornal do Brasil. There seems to be a sense of inevitability about the big five going ahead and becoming what you predict they will become. And can you just tell us why, what it is that's driving this?
Sure. Yeah, no, if I gave that impression, then that was certainly contrary to my desires. I should also point out, actually, that this particular study, the Big Five study, is not a formal forecast. It's what we call a scenario. We usually do our forecast out for 10 years. This time we've looked kind of further on out. We've made various assumptions. These can fall into kind of two areas. One is essentially a continuation of the globalization trend that we've seen over, say, the last 10 or 15 years, and that this continues for another 25 years. So we've assumed further trade liberalization over and above, completion of the Uruguay round, but then further liberalization over and above the Uruguay round, especially in developing countries, but also in developed countries. So we have, for example, assumed restrictions on agricultural trade being slashed in half of what they are today. We've assumed a continuation of the technological progress in transport and communication, so that steadily declining trend in transport and telecommunications, which is a further stimulus for world trade. Those are in terms of the external environment. I may be forgetting some, but those are the main ones. The other ones are the internal ones, and again, it is a continuation of the trends that we have already seen in developing countries and in the Big Five. In terms of continuation of domestic policy reforms, and we've already in the question and answer session discussed some of those. They differ, of course, across countries and regions, but they include the kind of standard set of things such as macroeconomic stabilization, trade reforms, etc., as well as the issues which are coming to the fore now that Joe has stressed in his comments in terms of the kind of second generation reforms, institutional development, and so on. We've kind of assumed that all of these efforts carry on. And we have, as a result of that, we have then assumed a pickup in productivity growth and in capital accumulation in these countries. Now, I should note that for some of these countries, it's not actually a pickup. It's just a continuation of what already exists. You know, Indonesia has been growing at 7% for some time. India has been growing at 5.5% for some time. We're actually, for China, we're actually assuming that the growth is less than what it has been. I mean, in the last 5 or 6 years, China has been growing at around 12% or something staggering like that, when in the forecast, it's a more sustainable, restrained kind of growth around 7% or something. For Brazil, also we are growth, we're expecting it to be higher than in the 1980s, which were a very disastrous decade, but not much higher than what Brazil has already achieved in the 1990s so far. And possibly the most kind of speculative assumptions might be with respect to Russia, where obviously the country has gone through much more severe problems and crisis, but it's slightly more optimistic. But again, all we're saying is that over time the country puts into place the necessary macroeconomic adjustments and the institutional development, arriving at a pickup in growth of, I believe it's somewhere around 5% or so, which a good part of that for many years would simply be making up the losses that have taken place in output over the last 5 or 6 years. So these are the kinds of assumptions. As far as growth goes, there's nothing very remarkable. I think what does happen, though, is that if you assume these things for a long enough period of time, it's the 25-year stretch. Also relative to, if you look at consensus views on industrial country growth, industrial countries probably growing somewhere in a 2 to 3% range. That's the kind of consensus of where they are. These other countries which are getting their house in order, which are at much lower levels of income, which are able to import much more technology, which have much more room for growth, growing at 5.5%, which is the assumption. It's close. We assume the Big Five at about close to 6%, not quite 6% in aggregate altogether. Over 25 years, that gives you these very striking results.
Thank you. Carola Kaps, Frankfurt Allgemeine. Up to the 90s, you always said that it was very important for the growth in the LDCs that you had a benign climate in the industrial countries. From the 90s onward, when the LDCs became, or quite a few had this very astonishable growth rate, there was a certain disconnect, and one said, well, the LDCs are now growing, and the climate in industrial countries and the if there is a liberal climate worldwide, it really doesn't make so much difference anymore. Are we now at a point that we can reverse the equation, where all of a sudden you would have to say, in order for the industrial countries really to perform well, the LDCs have to grow and have to keep up a benign climate?
Well, what is true is that a very large fraction of the growth in the developed countries can be traced back to increased exports to the developing countries. This is true in the United States. In the last 4 years, the recovery of the U.S. economy, and I think it's going to be increasingly true in Europe and in Japan. So there is a sense in which this shouldn't come as a surprise. It's sort of the developing countries, including especially the Big Five, have become sort of the engine of growth for the whole world economy. And there's the recognition of this should reinforce the commitment on the part of the developed countries to maintain a liberal trade regime, to address some of their major problems in agriculture, to open up their economies in the way that the developing countries have been opening up their markets fairly rapidly. And I think obviously in the long run there's a two-way dependence that the long-run prospects of the developing countries depend in part on their trade with the developed, but it's now become a more even balance in terms of the interactions.
Yes, no, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, this kind of mutuality is going to become more and more important over time. That's one of the messages that comes out from the study that we've done here.
In the middle with the mic.
I'm Greg Rushford. I published the Rushford Report on trade politics. Are you tracking the spread of anti-dumping regimes around the world, the sort of copycat versions of the U.S. anti-dumping laws, and are you worried about this trend in the coming years?
Yes, I am worried about this. I obliquely referred a little earlier in response to one of the questions about dangers of non-tariff barriers replacing tariff barriers, and among the most perfidious of these non-tariff barriers are those associated with dumping laws and CVDs, countervailing duties, and in some cases surge laws. Dumping duties have been used by a few developed countries as a way of, as I say, as a replacement for protectionist policies, keeping out, there's a general view in the world that trade is good, but imports are bad. And there's a belief in many parts of the world that if trade were fair, no country could really compete and sell against our producers, because we obviously have the best producers. I mean, every country has this sense that if the only reason somebody can outsell us is they must be engaged in unfair trade. And that is what provides the emotive support behind behind the dumping laws. We say that clearly if they are undercutting us, that must be because they're selling below costs. But the dumping laws that have been written for the most have many provisions which argue that there has been dumping when in fact prices are not below marginal cost, in which they're not dumping. in which there is not predatory pricing policies, so that the laws do not reflect economic concepts. And there is a real concern that while some of the developed countries have shown leadership in exploring this new avenue of protectionism, that other countries will imitate those policies, adopt those laws. And it's not only the laws, it's how those laws are implemented. If those practices became very widespread, it would be a very serious problem for continuation expansion of international trade, which has provided so much of the engine for world economic growth over the last decade.
Sorry, just to add on to that, on page 71 of the report, we have a page and a half box dealing exactly with this issue of anti-dumping. And what the facts suggest is actually in the last year or so, amongst industrial countries, anti-dumping actions reported to the WTO by industrial countries have actually gone down. But the worrying trend is that more developing countries are beginning to use these kinds of anti-dumping measures, which are actually quite harmful for the country's welfare as a whole, even though they may benefit particular interest groups. So I would recommend that you take a look at that.
Okay, yeah, far right over there in the corner.
Barry Wood, Voice of America. Mr. Stiglitz says weeks have turned into months on the Thailand problem. What's your view as to why Thailand got into trouble? And how has that affected, or how should that affect bank policy?
Any crisis involves a number of complexities and difficult to summarize very briefly, but let me give you a snapshot of some of the elements that are reflected in Thailand, and I think are reflected in a number of other examples in the past in currency crises. One element is an overvalued exchange rate, which is a consequence quite often of an attempt of a country to maintain its exchange rate at an artificial level. Exchange rates are market phenomena. They're prices between two currencies. And prices in general, we argue, ought to be determined by market forces and market processes. This was the major change that happened in the world in the early 1970s, when the world went off of the fixed exchange rate system and went into a flexible exchange rate systems. Several countries in the past have not fully gotten the message of the new exchange rate regime. It's only been a quarter century, and have tried to maintain exchange rates at levels that are not sustainable. What happens then is that as the evidence eventually mounts, rather than continual adjustments that you get with a flexible exchange rate system, you get a very large adjustment. And that was one of the arguments a quarter century ago for moving off of the fixed exchange rate system. Secondly, I referred in my introductory remarks to the importance of getting your financial sector in order. And that is part of the institutional infrastructure that makes an economy work. Financial systems are vital for economic growth. Our research at the World Bank has shown very strongly the connection not only between economic growth and the financial depth, but also between financial problems in financial systems and disruption in growth, economic crises. So long-term economic growth really requires having a good financial system. And I think there's been a concern about the strength of the Thai financial system, and we are preparing now at the World Bank a technical assistance, some work with their financial, to help strengthen their financial system. An aspect of the financial system that has played a role in financial crises, not only in Thailand, but in many other countries, is excessive speculation in real estate. And that seems to be an aspect of the phenomena there. What is important is the restoration of confidence in their economy. and the restoration of confidence will require a number of factors, including addressing the long-term structural issues and such as the financial system, and I think maintaining the economy in a strong way. Now, let me just mention a couple of other points. One of them is the fundamentals in Thailand, as in many of the other East Asian countries, remain very strong. These economies are economies that have had very high savings rates. They've had high levels of investment in human capital. They've had real growth of the economy over a period of a quarter century, 3 decades or more, that is really phenomenal, and that has had real progress, made real difference to the living standards of the people, and reduced poverty in a very significant way. One should not lose sight of the fundamental strengths of the economies of Southeast Asia and East Asia. These economies have done a very impressive job. And as one tries to assess what's going to happen in the future, I think these fundamentals will continue to show through. One aspect of the fundamentals that have made these economies have had such a long period of economic strength is their adaptability. They have faced problems in the past and have addressed those problems forcefully. For instance, Malaysia had a banking problem in 1983-84, which it, on its own, addressed very effectively. So these countries have, like all economies, have faced problems in the past, and they've shown their adaptability in addressing those problems. Our challenge should be to find ways of addressing their problems in ways that will make sure that the pause in their economic growth is as short as possible, and in which the downside risks are minimized.
Let's take a second row here, and then we'll come up the back there.
Mr. Press Trust of India. To what extent do you assume that the present low-tech and labor-intensive situation in the developing countries will continue? Or do you assume that the developing countries will also close the technology gap during the next 25 years, so that technology-wise and research-wise, the two worlds will be more or less similar? Secondly, I was wondering why you describe Russia as a developing country, because it produces some of the most advanced submarines in the world. It produces some of the best fighter planes in the world, and by all accounts, Russia has some of the best technologies in the world. I was wondering why you regard it as a developing country.
Well, let me answer the first question, and Milan will take the second. We at the bank are increasingly focusing on the transfer of knowledge as well as the transfer of capital, which has been the traditional focus of the bank. In fact, our president likes to talk about the bank as being a knowledge bank, in recognition of the fact that what separates the developed from the less developed from the developing countries is not just the fact they have less capital or even less human capital, but they also have less knowledge. And in recognition of that, the importance of that, the WDR, the World Development Report for next year, is going to focus on the role of knowledge and development. And it will focus on issues about what are strategies that countries can adopt that will reduce the knowledge gap. Now, our hope is that in 25 years, the knowledge gap will be reduced. It will not be fully eliminated. Even within a country, there are gaps in knowledge between the most advanced companies and the least advanced companies. So knowledge, the transmission of knowledge is always it's a costly process, and it's a process that takes time. But there's a lot more that we can do to speed up that process.
Yeah, on your second question, it's sort of fairly straightforward in the sense that we define developing countries as countries that have a per capita income level below a certain cutoff point. I think it's around about $9,500 at present. makes you a low and middle income country, either low income or middle income, and that in our definition is a developing country. So Russia falls within that classification. Perhaps a better way to call it might be developing and transition economies. That might be another.
Okay, second to last row.
Yes, very quickly. Paulo Sotero from o Estado de São Paulo, Brazil. Very quickly on something Mr. Stiglitz mentioned on agriculture markets in developed countries. Brazil, India, Indonesia, and other developing countries have been insisting on an opening of agricultural markets in developed countries. What kinds of assumptions have you made in your study about what could happen there? Will, in the next 25 years, Europe, the United States, become free traders in agriculture?
Well, we have made an assumption that restrictions on agricultural trade are very significantly cut. This specific assumption, I think, is they're cut by about a half or so. But that, of course, is a different thing from whether it would actually happen. I mean, that may be something that Joe may want to address on how that is moving ahead. But the assumption we have made is that there is a very marked reduction in agricultural protectionism. And that has various effects that we can actually trace in the results of the study, and they're included in the report.
Let me just comment on one aspect of that. Within the United States, the agricultural bill that was passed last year is a very marked move towards a market economy in agriculture in most aspects of agriculture, in the grains, in wheat and corn, and so is clearly a commitment to move towards a market-based system. There remain areas that in which progress has not been as fast, like sugar, which are obviously important to address, and that. The lack of progress in agriculture obviously has adverse effects on developing countries, many of whom are exporters of agricultural goods.
Okay, Mr. Aslam, over there.
Abid Aslam from Interpress Service. Picking up on a previous question and training the focus for a moment on the bank itself, you emphasize the importance of domestic financial sector soundness. What's the current state of bank policy on financial sector affairs? Is there now a bank policy on financial sector affairs? I understand there's been some protracted debate on this. Second question, this scenario that you've drawn, what significant implications might it hold for the bank's own loan portfolio, particularly as you sift the winners from the losers, albeit in a transitional phase?
Let me address the first question. I wasn't quite sure I understood the second. The first question is what is the bank policy towards domestic financial reforms. This was part of one of the important ingredients in the Strategic Compact, the recognition, and it's part of a broader recognition. There's been a switch to increased emphasis on private sector, the role of the private sector in promoting economic growth. The recognition that the huge private capital flows means that in many sectors of the economy, not all, the private sector can provide capital provided the right policy framework is put into place. Part of that right policy framework we recognize now is having an appropriate financial structure, a financial regulatory system. There are many dimensions to this. It's not only banking system, but it's also capital markets, equity markets that play an important role in making financial systems work. There is, as I said, a very strong commitment of the bank to address these issues, and both in our research and in our policy advice, and that we are working with countries to improve to strengthen their financial sectors, with their capital markets, whether it's the equity market or whether it's the banking sector. So there isn't any real controversy about the importance of this, and our researchers continue to document how important it is.
Gentleman in the middle here.
Harun Kazaz, Capital TV News and Turkish Pro. My question is related to Russia. I understand you're talking about the scenario, and while you were choosing Russia as one of the 5 countries, at what point do you anticipate Russia's economy to kick in within the next 25 years to significantly contribute this scenario? 10 years from now, 15 years from now, or?
I should first actually point out that these 5 countries were chosen on a very simple basis. These are the 5 countries with the 5 largest populations in this group of developing and transition countries. I think, I mean, the general view seems to be of the Russian economy gradually stabilizing in the next year or two. I mean, we've reached a situation, I think, where the pace of decline has reduced a lot, has diminished, and over the course of the next year or two, I think we will be looking for some sort of stabilization, and then gradually, over a period after that, as different reforms that we assume kick in, to have a gradual pickup in the rate of economic growth towards, if things work out in the way that the scenario foresees it, perhaps by the end of the decade, there will be very sustained kind of pickup in growth.
Second row gentleman there. And then we'll have time rather, for about one more, and then we'll wrap it up.
Hi, Rich Miller with USA Today. You mentioned about a pause in growth potentially for East Asia and Thailand. I wonder if are you expecting Thailand to enter in a recession as a result of the crisis we've seen, and what about the other countries in the region? And sort of related to that, how much do you think the expansion of export capacity from China that we've seen because of the really heavy investment there has played a role in the crisis?
Okay. First, let me say for East and Southeast Asia as a whole, we are not forecasting a decline in economic growth. I mean, that is to say, as Milan pointed out, in terms of our long-run forecast, we don't believe that it will continue with the enormously fast pace that it had in the past decade, but we anticipate, as those numbers showed, sustained strong economic growth over the coming decade. I was focusing more on Thailand, and the question there is whether it will be a pause in growth, or just a slowdown in economic growth. I think it's too soon to tell what the scenario is. Some of the growth, in terms of the statistics that one saw earlier, was obviously, you might say, not fundamental growth. When you're building commercial real estate that's going to be empty, it shows up in your GDP statistics, but it's not leading to a rise in standards of living. So some of the slowdown will be a statistical slowdown, but may not actually be a slowdown in terms of real productive growth. The final question you asked was the role of the increased export capacity of China. What role did that play? I think very little role. The factors that I described earlier in my answer to the question from the Voice of America, I think can provide most of the explanation. And in fact, one's view in that is reinforced by the fact that as their exchange rate has come down, their exports have already started to increase. And that increase in exports, I think, suggests that it may be that they may be able to forestall a significant downturn in their economy. Did you want to add anything, Milan?
I think, I mean, we don't really sort of forecast numbers for individual countries, but one can look at the range of views which are out there, and I think the biggest I've seen is, I think JP Morgan was looking for Thailand's growth to come down to about 1% growth. So I don't think anyone is expecting a recession. And the range probably goes from around 1% to 3%, something like that this year, with a recovery from next year onwards to some extent. It's also the case that Thailand would be the most seriously affected. Other countries in Southeast Asia would be less seriously affected. In East Asia as a whole, I think growth in China, the indicators are growth in China is actually picking up this year. So for the region as a whole, growth may still be sort of quite solid.
One aspect that may provide some insight is the rapidity with which Mexico was able to restore itself, and the fundamentals in Thailand, many people believe, are actually much stronger than what Mexico faced at that time. And those who take that view are even more optimistic about the speed of recovery, and that the pause, slowdown in growth may even be shorter-lived.
Okay, our last question, Ms. Katz in the third row there.
I have a question on the currency regime. You said that one of the reasons you had these turbulences in Asia is because the pegging of the currency, and that we had gone already since '71 into a flexible exchange rate regime, and this was not, this was really an obsolete concept. On the other hand, you have the institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, recommending for certain countries a currency board and a pegging of exchange rates and an anchor exchange rate. Where is the point of where you have to change from a peg, where it makes sense to have it pegged, into the floating or the flexible regime?
Well, the anchoring perspective was a reflection, was a perspective that was emphasized particularly in the late 70s, early 80s, when many countries faced very high inflation rates. And the question was, how do you create confidence that you will bring the inflation rate down? And by anchoring it, it meant it was very clear that you'd anchor the system down in a way that made it a commitment to reducing inflation credible. And as far as the world regime we're in, we have now moved from a period of high inflation of the 70s and to some extent in the early 80s to a regime in which the world is experiencing much lower inflation. The chart that Milan gave you earlier showed the data on how rapidly and how to the extent to which inflation has come down in the world today. And therefore, the worry about inflation is really much less on people's mind. Now, there are particular countries for which that is not true, who have gone through particular episodes, and for which the worry about inflation, the concern about their commitment to fight inflation, to get out of hyperinflation, remains a valid concern. And then one has to make a judgment call about the balance of risks and make a decision about whether the balance of risk go on one side or the other. It may be that there are more effective or almost as effective ways of making a credible commitment to fight inflation that do not seem to have the evident cost that the nominal anchor clearly has. And that is one of the areas that I think